The sun had barely risen over Kiev, casting long shadows across the crumbling streets. The once beautiful city was now a ghost of its former self, ravaged by the war that had torn the country apart. Alina stood in front of a makeshift hospital, her eyes scanning the horizon, her heart heavy with worry. The city had been quiet for days, but she knew it wouldn't last. The sounds of distant artillery and the occasional rumble of tanks reminded her that danger was always near. She hadn't seen her family in months. Her mother and younger brother had fled to Poland shortly after the fighting began. Alina hadn't been able to go with them. She had chosen to stay and help those in need, even if it meant putting herself in harm's way. Every day was a battle, not just against the enemy, but against the fear that gripped her heart. Inside the hospital, the situation was dire. Supplies were running low, and the wounded were piling up faster than they could be treated. There were no more ambulances to bring people in, and the staff was dwindling. Alina was the only nurse left at the hospital, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the building itself would become a target. She pushed these thoughts aside as she walked down the narrow hallways, checking on the few patients still in stable condition. Most of them were civilians who had been caught in the crossfire, mothers, fathers, children, all victims of a war they never asked for. Alina's heart ached for them. She couldn't help but wonder how many of them would make it through the night. Despite everything, Alina kept going. She had no other choice. As she rounded a corner, she froze. There, lying motionless on the floor, was a soldier. His uniform was stained with blood, and his face was pale. He couldn't have been much older than her. Without thinking, Alina rushed to his side. She had seen soldiers like him before, young men sent off to fight, their lives cut short by a conflict that seemed endless. But this one, he was different. His eyes, though half closed, were filled with a quiet desperation, and she felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. "Please, help me," he whispered weakly, his voice barely audible. Alina hesitated. He was Russian. He was her enemy. But something about the way he looked at her, so vulnerable, made her forget the hatred she was supposed to feel. She took a deep breath and checked his pulse. It was weak, but steady. "You're going to be okay," she said, more to reassure herself than him. She had no idea how long he would survive, but she couldn't just leave him there. As she worked to stop the bleeding and stabilize him, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. Alina's hands shook slightly as she worked to stop the bleeding. She had treated many soldiers over the years, but something about this one unsettled her. Perhaps it was his youth, his vulnerability, or maybe it was the strange sense of connection she felt despite knowing they were on opposite sides of the war. She managed to stabilize him long enough to move him to a safer corner of the makeshift hospital, a small room that had once served as a classroom. Alina quickly gathered what little medical supplies she had left, wiping the sweat from her brow. The soldier was still unconscious, and she knew she had little time before he might wake up and realize where he was. But for now, she had a few minutes to gather her thoughts. As she worked, her mind wandered to the situation at hand. The war had taken everything from her: the security of her home, the love of her family, the peace of her country. She had watched as her city burned, her people suffered, and her sense of safety vanished with every passing day. But it wasn't just the war that had broken her. It was the fact that there was no end in sight, no clear resolution, just a constant state of fear and loss. Alina sat back in a chair beside the soldier, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft groan. The soldier stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, he appeared confused, disoriented. His gaze shifted to Alina, and he frowned, as if trying to place her in the chaos of his memory. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You're safe for now," Alina replied softly, her tone cautious. "I'm here to help you." The soldier blinked, as though trying to process her words. His gaze shifted to his bandaged arm, and then back to her face. "You're Ukrainian?" Alina nodded. "Yes," I'm a nurse." There was a long pause as the soldier seemed to consider her words. His expression was a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice growing weaker. "I'm the enemy." Alina didn't have an answer. She'd asked herself the same question ever since she had found him lying on the floor. Why had she chosen to help him instead of leaving him to die, as she'd been taught to do with enemy soldiers? But she couldn't explain it. She only knew that something in her heart wouldn't allow her to turn her back on him, no matter who he was. I don't believe in the hatred," Alina said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. It's not our fault. We're all just people." The soldier looked at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers. Alina could see the conflict within him, the deep sense of guilt that mirrored her own. He was just a young man caught in a war that didn't belong to him, and she was no different. The war had taken everything from both of them, but it hadn't taken their humanity. "Thank you," the soldier whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." Alina didn't know what to say. She had never been good with words, especially not in situations like this. All she could do was nod and offer him a reassuring smile, even though it didn't feel real. It wasn't easy to find hope in a world as broken as theirs, but somehow in this moment, she felt a tiny spark of it. Maybe it was the soldier's gratitude, or maybe it was the connection between them that transcended the circumstances. She stood up, wiping her hands on her blood-stained apron. "Rest now," she said. "I'll be back soon." As she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change everything. She didn't know how, but she felt certain that the path ahead would be different from anything she had ever imagined. Days passed, and the war continued to rage on outside the walls of the hospital. Alina spent her time moving from patient to patient, tending to the wounded, and occasionally returning to the soldier's room to check on him. She had learned his name even, and despite their stark differences, they had formed an unexpected bond. Each time Alina entered his room, Ivan was awake, his eyes studying her with a mix of curiosity and confusion. At first, their conversations were short and filled with awkward pauses, the weight of their respective sides and the conflict hanging over them like a heavy curtain. But as the days wore on, the awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding. They shared stories of their lives before the war, Alina's peaceful childhood in Kiev, Ivan's memories of his family in Russia, and their mutual longing for a time before everything had been turned upside down. The hospital, once a place of quiet desperation, had become their refuge from the chaos of the world outside. There was something strangely comforting about the routine they had settled into. Alina would come in every morning, bringing fresh water and food for him, and they would talk about anything and everything. Their conversations were simple, but they gave both of them a sense of normalcy amidst the madness. One morning, as Alina entered his room, she found him sitting up in bed, staring out the small window. The sky was overcast, a dull gray that seemed to mirror the bleakness of the situation. "You're up early today," Alina remarked, setting down the tray of food she had brought for him. Ivan didn't respond immediately. He was lost in thought, his brow furrowed. After a moment, he turned to face her, his eyes tired but steady. "I don't know if I can go back to the front lines," he said quietly. "I don't know how much longer I can keep fighting." Alina felt a pang in her chest. She knew exactly what he meant. The thought of sending him back to face the horrors of the war was unbearable. But she also knew there was nothing she could do to change the course of the conflict. Her country was at war, and no matter how she felt, the fighting would continue until someone, somewhere decided it was over. But she also saw something in Ivan that she hadn't seen in many of the soldiers she had treated. There was a weariness in him, a deep fatigue that came from more than just physical injury. It was the exhaustion of a person who had been forced into a fight they didn't choose. "You don't have to go back," she said softly. "Not today, not yet." Ivan's gaze softened, and for a moment, Alina could see a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but his expression spoke volumes. It was the first time she had seen him truly relax since he had arrived in her care. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, and he leaned back against the pillows, closing his eyes. "I wish it could be different," Ivan murmured. Alina nodded, unable to find the words that would make the situation any better. She understood the weight of his wish. She wished for the same thing, to go back to a time before the war, to a time when their lives hadn't been torn apart by conflict. "I know," she whispered. "I wish it too." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the shared understanding that their words couldn't change anything. But in that silence, there was a strange sense of peace, a fleeting moment of connection amidst the chaos of the world outside. Later that evening, as Alina sat in the small break room, she couldn't stop thinking about Ivan's words. She'd always been the one to carry the weight of others' pain, but now it felt as though Ivan had given her a piece of his own burden to carry. She had no answers for him, no solutions to the conflict that had taken so much from them both. All she had was her presence, her care, and a willingness to listen when he needed to talk. And for now, that was enough. The next day, Alina found Ivan sitting by the window again, but this time he wasn't staring out into the gray sky. He was looking down at the floor, his hands resting in his lap. There was something different about him, something softer, more vulnerable. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but uncertain. Maybe there's a way for me to make things right." Alina looked at him, her heart beating faster. She had no idea what he meant, but she could sense the hope in his words. The hope that, despite everything, there might still be a chance for redemption, a chance for him to do something more than just fight. She leaned in, her voice gentle. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet," Ivan replied, his eyes meeting hers. "But I want to try, I want to help. Maybe there's more to life than just the war." Alina smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of hope and fear. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to find peace, even in the midst of the chaos. The weeks passed, and with each one, the bond between Alina and Ivan deepened. The war outside continued to ravage the land, but within the hospital's sterile walls, a quiet revolution was taking place. Alina and Ivan spoke more freely now, their conversations flowing like the familiar rhythm of old friends, sometimes light and easy, other times heavy with the weight of their shared experiences. Alina found herself looking forward to her shifts with a growing sense of anticipation. It wasn't just the patients or the duty that drew her in anymore. It was Ivan. She had come to care for him in a way she hadn't expected, and as much as she tried to push the feelings aside, she knew she couldn't ignore them forever. One evening, as Alina was preparing to leave after another long shift, she found herself standing at the door to Ivan's room again. The evening sky outside had darkened, and the hospital was quieter than usual. Ivan was sitting up in bed, looking out the window, his expression distant. She hesitated before stepping inside, but once she did, Ivan turned to her with a soft smile. There was something different about him tonight. His eyes weren't as tired, his shoulders not as heavy. "Alina," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about something." She closed the door gently behind her and walked toward his bed. "What's on your mind?" Ivan looked down at his hands for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. "I can't go back to the front lines. Not after everything that's happened. I want to do something more, something that matters." Alina's heart skipped a beat. She'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to find the courage to make a decision that would change his life. She nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I understand, but you're not alone in this. You don't have to make this decision by yourself." Ivan met her gaze, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. "But I don't know what to do. The war, it's everything I've known for so long. How do I let go of it?" Alina sat down beside him, her heart aching for him. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the internal battle between the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. "You don't have to let go of everything all at once," Alina said softly. "It's not about forgetting the past. It's about choosing a different path." one small step at a time. Ivan's lips curled into a small, thoughtful smile. I never thought I'd find peace in a place like this. But maybe you're right. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their words hanging between them. Alina could feel the unspoken promise growing between them, a promise that, no matter what happened, they would be there for each other, helping each other navigate the uncertainty of their futures. The next morning, Alina arrived at the hospital early, as she always did. As she walked down the sterile, quiet halls, she found herself thinking about Ivan and the decision he had made. She hadn't expected him to find clarity so quickly, but maybe in his heart, he had already known the truth. The war had broken him in ways he had never fully understood, but it had also given him the chance to rebuild, to find something more than just survival. When she entered his room, she was met with an unexpected sight. Ivan was sitting up, his face determined and clear-eyed. There was a small bag packed by his side. "You're leaving?" Alina asked, her voice a mix of surprise and concern. Ivan nodded. "I don't know where I'm going yet, but I can't stay here anymore. I need to make things right. I need to help. Maybe there's a way to make amends, to undo some of the damage I've caused." Alina's heart sank. She had known this day would come, but she hadn't realized how much she would miss him. It wasn't just about his presence in the hospital, it was the way he had begun to heal, the way his spirit had started to shine through the darkness. She had come to care for him deeply, and the thought of him leaving made the ache in her chest grow stronger. "I understand," Alina whispered, "but promise me one thing. Don't forget that you're not alone." "You don't have to do this alone." Ivan met her gaze, his expression softening. "I won't forget. I don't think I could, even if I tried." They shared a quiet moment, the weight of the words they hadn't spoken hanging between them. Then, with a final glance, Ivan stood and picked up his bag. He was no longer the broken soldier who had first arrived at the hospital, but someone determined to find a new path, a new purpose. "I'll be back," he said quietly. "I'll come back when I know what to do." Alina watched him walk out of the room, his figure disappearing down the hall. A part of her wanted to run after him, to tell him to stay, but she knew it was time for him to find his own way. She had given him the tools to begin his journey now. It was up to him to walk that path. As the door closed behind her, Alina felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The hospital was quieter now, the world outside still filled with the sounds of war. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like something had shifted. Evan was gone, but his journey had just begun. And so had hers. The hospital felt emptier after Evan left, as though a piece of it had walked out with him. Alina found herself returning to her work with a sense of quiet resolve. She had seen Evan at his lowest, and now she had seen him begin to rise. It was a bittersweet feeling, proud, yet heavy with the knowledge that he was embarking on a path unknown, one that might take him far away from her. Days turned into weeks, and life at the hospital continued. But Alina couldn't help but wonder where Evan had gone, whether he was safe, whether he had found the peace he was seeking. Every now and then, she would catch herself thinking about him, imagining what he was doing, if he had truly found a new purpose. Then, one crisp autumn morning, as Alina was heading into work, she received a letter. It was from Evan. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, her heart racing with curiosity. Inside, there was a short note, written in Evan's familiar handwriting. _Alina, I've left the front lines for good this time. I'm in a small village now, working with others who've been affected by the war, helping rebuild what we've lost. It's not much, but it's a start. Thank you for believing in me. I'll never forget what you did for me, how you helped me find the courage to change. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm finally on the right path. I'll keep you in my thoughts, and I hope we can cross paths again someday. Yours, Evan __. Alina's eyes filled with tears as she read his words. She had always known that Ivan had the capacity for change, but seeing him take such a bold step, choosing a life beyond the war, filled her with a profound sense of pride. He was making a difference, one small act at a time. She tucked the letter into her pocket, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. The journey she had shared with Ivan had been brief, but it had left an indelible mark on her heart. She knew that no matter what happened, they had both changed for the better. As the days went by, Alina continued her work, but now there was a new light in her heart. She carried with her the hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could be healed one person at a time. Ivan's letter had reminded her that even in the darkest times, change was possible. People could rise above their past, above their fears, and make the choice to be better. And though she still longed for peace in her homeland, Alina knew that peace began within. It began with the courage to change, to reach out, to offer a hand to someone else who was struggling. It began with love. The war was far from over, and there were still countless challenges ahead, but Alina felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would continue to do what she had always done, helping others, offering compassion and holding on to the belief that a better future was possible. And as she walked through the hospital halls that day, a small smile curved her lips. She knew that wherever Ivan was, he was walking his own path now, just as she was walking hers. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't seem so scary. Months passed since Ivan's departure, and life in Kyiv had started to regain some semblance of normalcy. Alina continued her work at the hospital, pouring herself into helping others, but she couldn't shake the quiet ache of longing that had settled in her heart. She thought of Ivan often, his courage, his struggle, and the hope he had found in the small village he had gone to. Her days had begun to feel routine, but there was always a part of her that was waiting for something, waiting for a sign that everything she had worked for had meaning. One crisp winter evening, Alina sat in her small apartment, sipping tea by the window. The city was blanketed in snow, the streets glowing under the streetlights. She watched the snowflakes swirl in the quiet, her thoughts drifting. She had given so much of herself to others, yet there was a part of her that still felt incomplete. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her thoughts. She picked it up, surprised to see an unfamiliar number. Hesitant at first, she answered. "Hello?" she said softly. "Alina?" The voice on the other end was familiar rough, but comforting. It was Ivan. Her heart skipped a beat. "Ivan?" she asked, hardly believing it. "Is it really you?" He chuckled softly. "Yes, it's me. I've been meaning to call you for months, but, well, you know how things go." She smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of joy and relief. "I've been thinking about you," she said, her voice catching slightly. "I'm so glad you called." "I needed to hear your voice," Ivan admitted. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized that even though I'm healing, there's someone I need to thank." Alina felt a flutter in her chest. "You don't need to thank me, Ivan. You did all the hard work. You've come so far." "I know," he said, his tone sincere. "But you showed me that there's always a way out, even when it seems impossible. You made me believe in myself again, and I wanted to tell you that." There was a long pause between them, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Alina's heart raced, unsure of what to say next. "Ivan," she finally said, her voice steady but soft, "I'm just glad you're okay. I'm proud of you." "I'm not just okay, Alina," Ivan replied, his voice growing more intense. I'm in love with you." Her breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a shock to her system. She had always cared for him, had always felt a connection that went beyond just patient and nurse. But to hear him say it so openly, it was unexpected. She started, but he interrupted her. "I know it's complicated. I know what we've been through, but I can't deny it anymore. I've been carrying this feeling for so long, and I need you to know. Even if it's not the right time, I need you to know how much you mean to me." Alina felt her chest tighten with a mix of emotions, fear, hope, uncertainty. She'd always known there was something between them, but she had never allowed herself to acknowledge it. Not with the war still raging, not with the uncertainty of their futures. But as she listened to Ivan, she realized that the future could wait. What mattered now was the truth they had both been running from. Ivan, she whispered, I've been feeling the same way. But I'm scared. Scared of what it means. Scared of what might happen. I understand, Ivan said gently. But I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I just needed to say it. And when you're ready, I'll be here. Alina closed her eyes, letting the weight of his words settle in her heart. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that perhaps they could rebuild their lives together. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. Thank you, Ivan, she said softly. Thank you for being honest with me. There was a silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the unspoken understanding that both of them had found something in each other, something they had almost given up on. I'll be here when you're ready, Alina, Ivan repeated. Take your time. I will, she said, a smile tugging at her lips. I'll be ready soon. As she hung up the phone, Alina sat back in her chair, her mind racing with thoughts and emotions. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't seem so frightening. Maybe they could build something beautiful together. Maybe they could find peace, not just in their hearts, but in their lives. And as the snow continued to fall outside, Alina made a promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would allow herself to embrace this new beginning, this new chance at happiness. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. The following days passed in a blur for Alina. She continued with her work at the hospital, her thoughts constantly drifting back to Ivan's words. I'm in love with you. It was a simple declaration, but it shook her to the core. She had always known that there was something special between them, but hearing him say it so openly left her grappling with the depth of her own feelings. She found herself looking out the window of her apartment more often, wondering what the future might hold. The war still raged on, and uncertainty loomed over every decision. Yet, the more Alina thought about Ivan, the more she realized that despite the chaos around them, there was something worth fighting for, something worth holding on to. One afternoon, as the snow began to fall softly outside, she sat down at her desk to write him a letter. It wasn't easy to put her feelings into words, but she knew it was important to share her heart with him. After all, he had been brave enough to do the same. Dear Ame, she began, I've been thinking about us a lot, about everything we've been through. And I've realized that no matter what's happening in the world around us, my feelings for you are real. I care about you deeply, and I'm ready to see where this can go. I know the world is uncertain, but perhaps the one thing we can control is how we choose to live our lives. And I choose you. When she finished the letter, Alina felt a wave of relief. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she was ready to explore this new chapter with Ivan. The uncertainty of the world could no longer hold her back from taking a step toward happiness. She sent the letter to Ivan, and within days, he replied. I've been waiting for you, his message read. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want to face it with you. I've been thinking about you every day, and I'm ready to start this journey together. Alina smiled as she read his words. She didn't know exactly how their story would unfold, but for the first time, she felt a sense of peace. They were no longer defined by the war or the chaos that surrounded them. They were defined by their love, their hope, and their willingness to choose each other despite everything. Over the following weeks, Alina and Ivan spoke regularly. Their conversations were filled with shared dreams of a future that was no longer dictated by. They talked about the possibility of rebuilding their lives together, of creating a safe space where they could be themselves, away from the turmoil of their past. One evening, after weeks of letters and phone calls, Ivan arrived at Alina's apartment in Kyiv. She opened the door to find him standing there, a small smile on his face, his eyes filled with warmth. There was no grand gesture, no overwhelming declaration, just the quiet certainty that they were meant to be together. I'm here, he said softly. Alina stepped forward, her heart beating fast in her chest. I'm glad you are, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. In that moment, all the uncertainty, All the fear that had once held them back seemed to melt away. They stood together in the doorway, not needing words to understand what had changed. It wasn't just the war that had brought them together. It was their shared strength, their ability to face the unknown with courage and love. As the days turned into weeks, Alina and Evan built a life together, piece by piece. They worked together to create a future filled with possibility, learning from their past but not letting it define them. They traveled, shared quiet moments in the snow-covered streets of Kyiv, and slowly began to heal, not just from the trauma of war, but from the loneliness that had once defined their lives. The war didn't end overnight, but Alina and Evan found solace in each other. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they were no longer alone. Together, they faced the uncertainty with the kind of love that could not be broken by borders, by conflict, or by fear. As the first spring flowers began to bloom in Kyiv, Alina and Evan stood hand in hand, ready to face the world together. The war had taught them many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was that love could flourish even in the darkest of times. And with each other, they knew they could overcome anything. Their journey was just beginning, but it was no longer one filled with fear. It was a journey of hope, of new beginnings, and of the kind of love that could heal even the deepest wounds.